They did not come for her with an army. They did not come with a warrant or a sentence or a blade held high in the name of law. They came the way rot spreads inside a city, quietly, invisibly, until it is everywhere. Alexandria, early spring, 415 AD. Once, this city had been the intellectual heart of the ancient world, a place where ships arrived heavy not just with grain and spices, but with ideas, where scholars argued beneath colonnades worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, where knowledge was not inherited by blood or belief, but earned through disciplined debate and doubt. That Alexandria existed now only as a memory, half buried beneath fear, factional violence, and religious certainty. And in that decaying city, one woman still lived as if truth mattered. Her name was Hypatia. She walked the streets without guards, not because she was naive, but because she believed something dangerous, something that civilizations in decline no longer tolerate. She believed that reason offered protection. That clarity could calm chaos. That wisdom, calmly spoken, could outlast rage. She was wrong. Hypatia was born sometime between 355 and 370 AD, into a world already tearing itself apart. The Roman Empire was Christianizing rapidly, not gently. Old gods were being erased, temples repurposed or destroyed, and ancient traditions branded as demonic remnants of a shameful past. Tolerance was preached in words, but power was enforced with fists. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was a mathematician and astronomer, one of the last recorded scholars associated with the fading intellectual tradition of the city. From childhood, Hypatia was trained not simply to memorize texts, but to interrogate them. Geometry was not numbers on a page. It was a language that revealed order beneath chaos. Astronomy was not superstition. It was proof that the universe obeyed laws, not moods. While most women of the time were denied even basic literacy, Hypatia was trained to stand before men and teach them, not as a novelty, not as a curiosity, but as an authority. By early adulthood, she had surpassed her father's reputation. She edited classical mathematical works. She refined astronomical instruments, such as the astrolabe. She taught Neoplatonic philosophy publicly, drawing students from across religious lines. Pagans, Christians, and Jews sat together in her lectures, listening to her explain Plato, Aristotle, and the idea that truth could be approached through reason and self-discipline. This alone made her dangerous. Alexandria in the early 5th century was no longer a city governed by debate. It was a city governed by mobs. Religious riots were common. Entire neighborhoods could erupt into violence overnight. Identity mattered more than law. Belief mattered more than evidence. Into this volatile environment stepped a man who understood power very well. Cyril of Alexandria. Cyril became bishop in 412 AD, inheriting not just a church, but an army of loyal followers. He believed unity came through dominance. To Cyril, compromise was weakness, and tolerance was a threat. His supporters included a group known as the Parabolani, officially caregivers for the sick, unofficially a disciplined street force. They intimidated opponents, enforced religious conformity, and when necessary, spilled blood. Opposing Cyril was a Roman prefect of Egypt, Orestes. Orestes represented imperial authority. He was Christian himself, but his loyalty was to Roman law, not ecclesiastical rule. In theory, he governed Alexandria. In practice, his power was constantly undermined by religious factions who answered to no secular authority, and Hypatia stood between them. She held no office. She commanded no followers. Yet Orestes sought her counsel openly. He respected her judgment. He trusted her restraint. In a city where everyone screamed, she spoke quietly, and that made her voice carry further. To Cyril's supporters, this was intolerable. A pagan woman advising the governor, a philosopher refusing baptism, a teacher who believed reason mattered more than revelation. She became a symbol. And symbols are easier to kill than arguments. The rumors began subtly, as they always do, that Hypatia practiced magic, that her mathematics were spells disguised as numbers, that her calm influence over powerful men was unnatural, that she stood in the way of reconciliation between the bishop and the prefect. None of these accusations needed proof. They only needed repetition. Street preachers hinted at her name without saying it. Sermons warned of false wisdom, of knowledge that led souls astray, of women who stepped outside their ordained place. Each word sharpened the crowd's suspicion. Hypatia knew the danger. Friends warned her. Students begged her to leave Alexandria, at least temporarily. Even Orestes urged caution, but she refused to flee, not out of arrogance, out of principle. If philosophers ran every time ignorance shouted, then ignorance would always rule. So she continued teaching, continued walking the streets, continued living as if Alexandria still belonged to reason. The day they came for her was not announced. There were no omens in the sky, no sudden eruption of violence, just another day in a city accustomed to fear. Hypatia left her home in her carriage, traveling through familiar streets. Somewhere along the way, she was recognized or identified or betrayed. Sources differ. What they agree on is what followed. A crowd gathered, not suddenly, not accidentally. Men shouted accusations. Hands reached for her clothing. She tried to speak, to reason, to calm, but reason has no power once a mob decides guilt. They dragged her from her carriage. Stones scraped her skin. Fabric tore. Voices rose, not in debate but in certainty. No soldiers intervened. No officials stepped forward. Law watched and said nothing. They pulled her through the streets toward the Caesareum, a former Roman temple now converted into a Christian church. The irony was suffocating. A place once dedicated to worship and learning will become the site of something unspeakable. Inside, they stripped her naked. Not quickly, not mercifully. Ancient historians falter here. Even those accustomed to describing execution struggled to put the next moments into words. They used vague phrases. They softened language. They hesitated. But the truth survives in fragments. They beat her. Then they took sharp shards of pottery, ostraca, broken pieces of clay used for writing notes or discarding trash. With these, they tore her flesh. Not once, not twice, over and over. They flayed her alive. Blood soaked the floor. The woman who had mapped the stars screamed until screaming was no longer possible. When she finally died, when her body gave out beneath the violence, they did not stop. They dismembered her corpse. They carried the pieces through the streets of Alexandria, and they burned what remained. This was not justice. It was erasure. By the time the ashes cooled, something irreversible had happened. A city that once prided itself on knowledge had chosen certainty over truth, obedience over inquiry, silence over reason. Before we go further, let this question sit with you, because it haunted Alexandria long after the blood was washed away. Would you have spoken, knowing this was a cost? The streets of Alexandria did not erupt in outrage after Hypatia's death. They went quiet. That silence was not peace. It was acceptance. By the next morning, blood had been scrubbed from the floor of the Caesareum. The broken pottery shards were swept away like refuse. Merchants reopened their stalls. Sailors unloaded cargo at the harbor. The city resumed its rhythms, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had changed, and everyone knew it. The murder of Hypatia was not a spontaneous accident of mob violence. Alexandria was used to riots. It was used to bodies. What unsettled the city was not that a woman had been killed, but who she had been and what her death meant. Hypatia had been untouchable for decades. She was respected across religious lines. Christians attended her lectures. Pagan elites defended her. Roman officials consulted her. She represented restraint in a city addicted to extremes. Her existence implied that reason could coexist with faith, that authority could be questioned without chaos. Her murder proved otherwise. In the days that followed, Orestes attempted to act. As Roman prefect, he was obligated to uphold imperial law. A mob killing, especially one this public, should have triggered arrests, trials, punishments. He demanded an investigation. He demanded accountability. He received nothing. The men who killed Hypatia did not hide. They did not flee the city. They melted back into the crowd, protected by numbers and loyalty. They were known. Everyone knew who they were affiliated with. Everyone knew who had benefited. But no one spoke, because Alexandria had already learned the lesson Hypatia died teaching. Truth does not protect you when power feels threatened. Orestes found himself isolated. Without local support, Roman authority meant little. He could not move against Cyril without risking civil war. He could not punish the Parabolani without provoking riots. Every option led to more blood, and Rome was far away. Within a short time, Orestes vanished from the historical record. He was not executed, not publicly disgraced. He simply disappeared. Reassigned, perhaps, removed quietly, forgotten. Cyril remained, and Cyril grew stronger. Publicly, the bishop denied involvement. He expressed regret in abstract terms. Violence, he said, was unfortunate, excessive, but he never named Hypatia, never condemned her killers, never acknowledged the ideology that had made her death inevitable. Privately, his authority was now uncontested. The city understood what lines could not be crossed. Soon after, Christian writers began reshaping the narrative. Some avoided the event entirely. Others framed Hypatia as a political agitator rather than a philosopher, a woman whose influence had caused unrest, a pagan whose refusal to convert made reconciliation impossible. The language was careful. No one wanted to justify the brutality outright, but no one wanted to challenge it either. One Christian historian, Socrates Scholasticus, wrote that Hypatia's murder brought great shame upon the Church of Alexandria. That sentence is echoed through centuries as evidence of moral clarity. But shame has limits. It does not punish killers. It does not restore the dead. It does not reverse the damage. Hypatia's school dissolved. Her students scattered. Some converted. Some left Alexandria. Some simply stopped speaking publicly. Philosophy did not vanish overnight, but it retreated indoors, away from crowds, away from attention. The message was clear. Think quietly. Teach privately. Or don't think at all. The city that once celebrated debate now punished it. This was not an isolated transformation. Alexandria was a warning signal for a world in transition. Across the former Roman Empire, old intellectual traditions were being replaced by institutional certainty. Questions were no longer tools for understanding. They were threats to unity. Hypatia had embodied a different model. She taught that truth required humility, that reason required patience, that wisdom did not arrive fully formed through revelation, but through disciplined inquiry and self-control. Her Neoplatonic philosophy emphasized inner purification, ethical restraint, and a pursuit of higher understanding. None of this was radical, but it was incompatible with absolutism. because absolutism cannot tolerate ambiguity, and philosophy thrives on it. The loss of Hypatia's writings compounds the tragedy. She authored commentaries on Diophantus, Apollonius, and Ptolemy, works that could have shaped the trajectory of mathematics and astronomy for centuries. Instead, they vanished, burned, neglected, or deliberately erased. We know her ideas only through second-hand references, through praise from students, through grudging respect from enemies, through the violence that ended her life. Her killer succeeded in something most executioners never manage. They killed not only the person, but the possibility. Alexandria's decline accelerated. Over the following centuries, the city lost its status as an intellectual center. What knowledge survived did so elsewhere, often preserved by Islamic scholars who translated Greek works into Arabic, while Europe forgot its own inheritance. Ironically, the ideas of Hypatia lived for were saved by cultures that had never known her name. And that is where the story becomes darker, because Hypatia's death did not mark the end of fanaticism. It marked its success. It proved that mobs could overrule law. That belief could silence inquiry. That fear could erase brilliance. And once that lesson is learned, it spreads quickly. No more public philosophers emerged from Alexandria in her tradition. No women would teach openly there again for centuries. The city adapted, not by growing wiser, but by growing quieter. Hypatia became a ghost, mentioned rarely, remembered selectively, reduced to a symbol long after the context that made her dangerous had faded. But symbols endure. During the Renaissance, European thinkers rediscovered her story and recoiled. Here was proof of what happens when reason is strangled. Enlightenment writers elevated her as a martyr, not to paganism, but to thought itself. Artists painted her death in lurid detail. Philosophers invoked her name as a warning. Historians argued endlessly about whether her murder was religious, political, or personal. They missed the point. It was all of those things, because societies do not break in only one way. They fracture when power fears questions. And here is the truth history rarely states plainly. Hypatia's killers believed they were righteous. They believed they had defended God. They believed they had purified their city. They believed they had done good. That belief is more terrifying than hatred, because hatred knows it is cruel. Certainty believes it is holy. And when certainty picks up a weapon, it does not ask if it is right, only if it is permitted. Alexandria permitted it. And by doing so, it buried its own future. Subscribe for more hidden horrors of the past, because stories like this do not belong safely in history books. They wait for conditions to repeat. Long after the crowd dispersed, long after the smoke from Hypatia's burned remains faded into the Alexandrian sky, the city carried on as if an infection had been cauterized. That illusion did not last. Violence leaves echoes, not the loud kind. Those fade quickly, but the quiet ones, the kind that change behavior, the kind that teach people what not to say, where not to stand, which questions not to ask. In the weeks after Hypatia's murder, something subtle happened in Alexandria's intellectual circles. Conversations shortened. Public debate stopped. Teachers lowered their voices or abandoned their lessons entirely. Students who once argued openly now listened without responding. The city did not lose knowledge overnight. It lost confidence in knowledge, and that loss was fatal. The philosophical schools that had survived centuries of political upheaval now faced something more corrosive than invasion or famine. They faced fear. Fear does not burn libraries in a single night. It simply ensures no one rebuilds them. Hypatia's absence was felt immediately. She had been more than a teacher. She had been a stabilizing force, a mediator between rival groups, a symbol that reason could still hold ground in a city ruled by extremes. Without her, polarization accelerated. Alexandria fractured further into religious enclaves, each suspicious of the other, each convinced of its own righteousness. Cyril's authority expanded into the vacuum. The Parabolani grew bolder. Street violence increased. Minor disputes escalated quickly because precedent had been set. Mobs were no longer just tolerated. They were effective. Law followed power, not the other way around. Christianity in Alexandria hardened, not spiritually, but politically. Doctrine became sharper. Dissent became heresy. Philosophy became dangerous not because it denied faith, but because it refused to submit to it unquestioningly. Hypatia had never attacked Christianity. Many of her students were Christian, but she had taught them to think before they believed. That alone was unforgivable. The church faced an uncomfortable contradiction after her death. It claimed moral authority, yet its silence had enabled brutality. To resolve this tension, later writers did what institutions often do. They reframed the victim. Hypatia was slowly transformed in narrative. No longer a philosopher of universal respect, she became a problematic figure, a woman too influential, a pagan too stubborn, a political actor masquerading as a teacher. Each retelling chipped away at her legitimacy, not to justify her murder explicitly, but to make it seem inevitable. This rewriting mattered, because history does not only remember what happened, it remembers how it was explained, and explanations shape permission. Her gender became central to these narratives. Ancient writers rarely miss the opportunity to remind readers that Hypatia was a woman who taught men. That detail, mentioned repeatedly, carried judgment. It implied transgression. It suggested imbalance. It hinted that disorder naturally followed when social boundaries were crossed. The message was clear to future generations. Stay in your place. Hypatia's place, according to her killers and her silencers, had been too visible. Meanwhile, the intellectual consequences deepened. Alexandria's once famous mathematical tradition dwindled. Astronomical research stagnated. Philosophy retreated into theology, losing its independence. The city that once produced original thought now focused on preservation, and even that was inconsistent. Knowledge did not die in Alexandria because it was wrong. It died because it was unprotected. Centuries later, scholars would puzzle over why so many classical works survived only in fragments, references, or translations. Hypatia's life provides one of the clearest answers. Ideas survive only where societies defend them. Alexandria chose certainty instead, and certainty is sterile. Ironically, the intellectual legacy of the ancient world was preserved not in Christian Alexandria, but in places far beyond it. In Baghdad, Damascus, Cordoba, centers of the Islamic Golden Age, Greek philosophy and science were translated, studied, and expanded. The works of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy survived because other civilizations valued inquiry when Alexandria no longer did. Hypatia's intellectual descendants lived on without her name. Europe would not rediscover these ideas until centuries later, during the Renaissance, when scholars stumbled upon Arabic translations of texts once taught openly in Alexandria. When they traced those ideas back, they found a missing chapter. They found her. To Renaissance thinkers, Hypatia became a symbol of everything lost when fanaticism triumphs. Artists painted her as a serene martyr surrounded by chaos. Philosophers invoked her as proof that reason had enemies, not just in ignorance, but in power. Yet even then, her story was incomplete. Her writings were gone. Her voice was gone. Only her death remained vivid. This is the cruel arithmetic of history. Creation takes generations. Destruction takes minutes. Hypatia had spent her life building understanding, refining knowledge, teaching restraint. Her killers needed only one afternoon to undo it. And still, they believed they had acted justly. This is the most unsettling legacy of her murder. Not the gore, not the brutality, but the moral certainty that accompanied it. No one involved believed they were villains. They believed they were defenders, protectors, servants of truth. That belief spread. It taught future generations that violence could be sanctified if framed correctly, that authority could absolve cruelty, that silence could equal consent. The pattern repeated across centuries. Intellectuals silenced, books burned, questions punished. Hypatia was not the first victim of this pattern, and she would not be the last. But her story remains uniquely haunting because it occurred at a crossroads, at the moment when the ancient world could have transitioned into something wiser. Instead, it retreated. Alexandria did not collapse immediately after her death. Cities rarely do. Decline is gradual, invisible, measured not in ruins but in absences, in voices no longer heard, in ideas no longer attempted. By the time later generations realized what had been lost, it was already irretrievable. Hypatia's name survived, but only as a warning. A reminder that civilizations do not fall when enemies attack them. They fall when they kill their thinkers. And by the time the cost becomes clear, there is no one left brave enough to say so out loud. If this story feels uncomfortably familiar, that is not coincidence. History does not repeat itself perfectly, but it rhymes relentlessly, and Hypatia's echo has never fully faded. By the time the dust finally settled in Alexandria, the city no longer resembled the place Hypatia had walked through so calmly for decades. Not because its buildings had collapsed, not because its harbors had emptied, but because its spirit had changed. Civilizations rarely announce their endings. They simply stop protecting the things that once made them alive. Alexandria did not fall and fire the day Hypatia died. It continued breathing, trading, praying, governing. Yet something essential had been quietly buried alongside her ashes. The belief that truth could exist without permission. What followed her murder was not immediate darkness, but narrowing. Thought narrowed. Speech narrowed. Possibility narrowed. People learned very quickly which opinions were safe and which ones were lethal. Teachers adjusted their lessons. Philosophers avoided certain subjects. Students learned to repeat rather than question. Survival replaced curiosity. And that, more than any riot or decree, marked the true end of Alexandria's ancient legacy. Cyril's power solidified. He would go on to play a major role in shaping Christian doctrine, eventually being declared a saint and a doctor of the church. His theological writing survived. His reputation endured. History would remember him as a defender of orthodoxy. Hypatia, by contrast, left no surviving books. That imbalance alone should disturb you. A man whose silence enabled a mob was canonized. A woman who taught restraint and reason was erased. Not entirely, but almost. Later generations struggled to reconcile this contradiction. Some tried to argue that Hypatia's death was an unfortunate anomaly, an excess of zeal rather than its natural outcome. Others insisted it was purely political, detached from faith itself. But this is where history becomes uncomfortable. Ideas do not operate in isolation. Politics provided the opportunity. Religion provided the justification. Fear provided the fuel. Remove any one of those, and the murder might not have happened. But all three were present, and all three were normalized. Hypatia stood at the intersection of everything that frightened a collapsing order. She was educated, independent, influential, calm, She could not be controlled through intimidation because she did not seek power. She could not be discredited through scandal because her life was disciplined. She could not be silenced through debate because she welcomed it. So she was destroyed instead. Her death sent a signal far beyond Alexandria. It told the Mediterranean world that ancient learning was no longer sacred, that philosophy no longer had immunity, that even revered teachers could be torn apart if they represented the wrong ideas at the wrong time. This was not the death of paganism versus Christianity. It was a triumph of certainty over inquiry. And certainty, once victorious, never stops expanding on its own. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Languages changed. Borders dissolved. But the pattern endured. Wherever belief hardened into unquestionable authority, thinkers became targets. Where questions threatened power, those who asked them were accused of corruption, treason, or moral decay. Hypatia's fate repeated itself in different names, different eras, different uniforms. The Renaissance looked back at her story with horror and fascination. Enlightenment thinkers elevated her as a symbol of reason strangled by fanaticism. Modern historians still debate the nuances of her death, parsing motives and affiliations, try to locate responsibility precisely. But nuance does not soften the outcome. A woman was flayed alive in a place of worship because she refused to surrender her mind. That is not ambiguity. That is fact, and it forces an uncomfortable reflection. Hypatia did not die because she attacked faith. She died because she refused to subordinate reason to authority. She believed truth required discipline, humility, and patience. She believed ignorance was not evil, but unexamined certainty was. She believed the universe was ordered, intelligible, and worthy of study. These beliefs were not heresy. They were competition. And competition is intolerable to absolute power. Alexandria's later decline cannot be blamed solely on her murder. History is never that simple. But her death stands as a marker, a moment when a choice was made, when a society demonstrated which values it would protect and which it would sacrifice. It chose control over curiosity, unity over understanding, silence over truth. The consequences unfolded slowly, but they unfolded relentlessly. By the time Europe reawakened intellectually centuries later, it had to relearn what Alexandria once taught openly. It had to reconstruct fragments of knowledge preserved elsewhere. It had to rediscover, piece by piece, what had been discarded in moments of fear. Hypatia's absence was part of that loss. Not because she alone held all that knowledge, but because her existence proved something essential. That wisdom can be gentle. That authority can be questioned. That a woman can teach men without chaos. That faith and reason need not destroy each other. Her killers did not just silence a philosopher. They silenced an example. And examples are dangerous. They show people what is possible. That is why they are erased first. Today, Hypatia is remembered more vividly than most of those who orchestrated her destruction. Her name survives in books, lectures, documentaries, and whispered admiration. She had become a symbol, but not the kind her killers intended. She is not remembered as a witch. She is remembered as a warning that civilizations rot not when enemies attack on the outside, but when fear dictates what may be thought. A warning that mobs feel righteous long before they feel guilty. A warning that silence is not neutrality. It is permission. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this. Hypatia did not believe she was brave. She believed she was being reasonable. She did not seek martyrdom. She sought understanding. She stayed in Alexandria not to defy anyone, but because she believed running would mean surrendering the very principle she lived by. That truth should not hide. Her death teaches us something darker than heroism. It teaches us how fragile reason is, how quickly it can be overwhelmed, how easily it can be reframed as a threat, how effortlessly people can be convinced that destroying a mind is an act of virtue. If the story unsettles you, it should, because nothing about it belongs safely in the past. The conditions that killed Hypatia still exist. The mechanisms still function. The justifications still sound familiar. All that changes are the names. So remember her, not as a relic of ancient history, but as a mirror, and ask yourself, quietly and honestly, if you had lived in Alexandria, would you have spoken, or would you have stayed silent, and told yourself it was not your responsibility? Subscribe for more hidden horrors of the past, because history does not repeat itself loudly. It waits for us to forget.